There is a metal holding up the bridge you crossed this morning. It is inside the building where you work. It is in the pipeline that carries the fuel that heats your home. It is in the rocket that just launched from a pad in the desert. It is in the car you drive, the train you take, and the phone in your pocket. You have never heard of it. It has no famous minds, no geopolitical crises named after it, no documentaries, no front pages. The world depends on it completely and talks about it almost never. It is called niobium, and one country controls 92% of the entire global supply. That country is not China. It is not Russia. It is not a Gulf state with a sovereign wealth fund and a seat at every table that matters. It is Brazil, and most Brazilians have no idea. This is the story of how a single nation came to control the most important metal the world has never discussed. What it did with that control, what it failed to do, and who quietly moved in to capture the value that Brazil left on the table. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what niobium actually does. Steel is the skeleton of the modern world. But pure steel has limits. It is heavy. It cracks under extreme cold. It weakens under stress. Engineers have known for a century that the properties of steel could be transformed by adding trace amounts of other elements. Niobium is the most powerful of those elements. Adding less than 0.1% of niobium to steel makes it dramatically stronger, lighter, and more resistant to heat, cold, and corrosion. You can build a bridge with 30% less steel if you use niobium-enhanced alloys. You can build a pipeline that operates at extreme temperatures. You can build a skyscraper that sways in the wind without fracturing. Every modern high-rise, every deep-water oil pipeline, every automotive chassis designed to pass crash safety standards, every gas turbine, every naval vessel built in the last 40 years, they all contain niobium. And then there is what niobium might become, because the same properties that make it extraordinary in steel make it a candidate for the next generation of batteries. Batteries that charge in minutes rather than hours. Batteries that do not degrade after thousands of cycles. Batteries that could make the electric vehicle revolution faster, cheaper, and more practical than lithium ever managed. The race to commercialize niobium batteries is already underway. The outcome is not yet certain, but if it works, the country that controls niobium will not just be supplying the steel industry. It will be supplying the energy storage industry for the rest of the century. That country, with 92% of global production, is the same one we just described. The same one whose population has largely never heard of this metal. The story begins, as most Brazilian resource stories do, in the ground itself. The Araxá Plateau in the state of Minas Gerais sits atop one of the largest deposits of niobium ever found. The geology is extraordinary. The ore is rich. The extraction is relatively straightforward by mining standards. It is, in the language of geologists, a world-class deposit. It was identified in the early 20th century. For decades, it was considered interesting but not urgent. The world did not yet know how much it needed niobium. Then, in the 1950s and 1960s, the steel industry began to understand what niobium could do. Demand grew. The Araxá deposit went from a geological curiosity to an industrial asset of the first order. A Brazilian company called CBMM, the Companhia Brasileira de Metalurgia e Mineração, took control of the Araxá mine. It invested in processing technology. It built relationships with steelmakers in Europe, Japan, and the United States. It became, over the following decades, the dominant supplier of niobium to the entire world. By the early 21st century, CBMM alone was producing more niobium than all other producers on Earth combined. The second and third largest producers were also Brazilian. The concentration was, and remains, almost without precedent in the global supply of any critical industrial material. No other nation has ever controlled such a large share of any resource this important. Not even the Gulf states at the peak of the oil embargo controlled 92% of global production. Not even China, at the height of its rare earth monopoly, reached these levels. Brazil, with niobium, achieved a form of resource dominance that has no modern parallel. And then, largely, it did nothing with it. This requires explanation. Because the instinct, when hearing that a single country controls 92% of a critical global resource, is to assume that country is powerful, rich, strategically positioned, a force that the rest of the world must reckon with. Brazil is none of these things, at least not because of niobium. The reason is a distinction that seems technical, but is in fact the entire story. There is a difference between controlling a resource and controlling its value chain. Brazil controls the resource. It does not control the value chain. CBMM mines niobium. It processes it into ferro-niobium, a product that steelmakers can use. It sells that product to steelmakers around the world at prices that have historically been kept low, in part to discourage the development of alternative sources, in part because of the competitive dynamics of the global steel market. What Brazil does not do is manufacture the steel. It does not build the bridges, the pipelines, the skyscrapers, or the cars. It does not capture the value added by turning raw niobium into finished infrastructure. It sells the ingredient, not the dish. This is the same pattern we have seen in every episode of this series. The country with the resource sells raw material. The countries without the resource add value, manufacture products, capture profit, and build geopolitical leverage. The terms of trade flow upward. The wealth flows elsewhere. Norway, which we discussed in the previous episode, broke this pattern with oil. It built a sovereign wealth fund. It demanded equity stakes. It retained ownership of the infrastructure. Norway today is one of the wealthiest nations per capita on Earth, and its wealth is directly traceable to decisions made about how to manage a resource. Brazil, with a monopoly far more complete than Norway ever had with oil, made different decisions. The resource was privatized. The pricing was conservative. The strategic vision was largely absent. The result is that niobium generates significant revenue for CBMM and its shareholders. It generates far less for Brazil as a nation than a resource of this rarity and importance should. In 2011, something happened that almost no one outside the financial press noticed. CBMM sold a 15% stake in the company to a consortium of Asian steelmakers, Japanese companies, South Korean companies, then later, a Chinese consortium. The transactions were presented as strategic partnerships, investment in the future, a way to secure long-term offtake agreements and fund expansion of the Araxá operation. What they were, in practice, was a transfer of ownership in the world's dominant niobium producer to the countries that most needed niobium. The buyers were not passive investors. They were the world's largest steel producers, the world's largest battery manufacturers, the world's largest consumers of the exact material they were now part-owning at the source. China, which by this point had already executed the rare earth strategy we discussed in episode 2, understood exactly what it was buying. Not just a commodity, an option on the future, a stake in the mine that would supply the batteries of the next generation, if niobium batteries proved viable. A seat at the table in a resource that had no alternative supply. The transaction was legal. It was commercially rational. It was approved by Brazilian regulators, and it quietly transferred a portion of the strategic control of Brazil's most important mineral monopoly to the very nations that had already demonstrated, with coal, rare earths, and lithium processing, that they understood how to turn resource access into geopolitical power. Brazil noticed. Then it moved on. For most of its history, niobium was a steel story. Important, but not urgent. Steel is foundational, but unglamorous. The world needed it. It paid for it. It did not fight over it. Then the electric vehicle revolution changed the calculation. The problem with lithium-ion batteries, as we discussed in the previous episode, is that they are slow to charge. They degrade with use, and they have their own supply chain vulnerabilities. Engineers have been searching for alternatives for years. Niobium emerged as a serious candidate. The physics are compelling. Niobium oxide anodes allow ions to move faster through the battery material. This means charging times measured in minutes, not hours. It means a battery that can be recharged thousands of times without significant degradation. It means a battery that performs better at both very high and very low temperatures. A vehicle with a niobium battery could charge as fast as filling a tank with petrol. The infrastructure requirements would be simpler. The battery life would be longer. The cold weather performance, which is the Achilles heel of lithium batteries in northern climates, would be transformed. CBMM has been funding research into niobium batteries for over a decade. It has partnerships with universities, with automotive companies, with battery manufacturers. It has announced pilot programs. It has filed patents. It is not alone. Japanese companies with stakes in CBMM have their own battery research programs. Chinese battery manufacturers have been studying niobium anodes for years. The race is not just about who can develop the technology. It is about who controls the supply when the technology arrives. If niobium batteries scale, the country with 92% of global niobium production will be sitting on something more valuable than an oil field. Because oil runs out. Niobium in a battery is recycled. The same atoms moving back and forth between electrodes, potentially for decades. The question is whether Brazil will capture that value, or whether the pattern will repeat. Whether the niobium will leave as a raw material and return as a finished battery, manufactured elsewhere, sold at a markup, with the strategic leverage held by someone else. We have now spent 7 episodes following the same story in different locations. A strait, a mineral, a currency arrangement, an island, an oil field, a salt flat, and now a metal. In each case, geography or geology placed something of extraordinary value inside the borders of a nation that did not choose it. In each case, the world arrived with appetite. In each case, the nation with the resource faced a choice about how to manage what it had. Some chose well, some chose poorly. Some had the choice made for them by external powers who understood what was at stake better than the nation itself. Brazil has not yet made its final choice about niobium. The resource is still there. The monopoly is still intact, though slightly diluted. The battery technology is still developing. The window has not closed. But windows do close. The rare earth window for nations other than China closed in the 1990s when Chinese pricing made Western mining uneconomic. The lithium processing window may be closing now as Chinese facilities entrench their dominance. The niobium window is open, but it will not stay open indefinitely. There is a model that works. Norway built it with oil. Botswana built a version of it with diamonds. The ingredients are consistent. A sovereign fund to capture resource rents, domestic processing capacity to add value before export, equity requirements for foreign investors, and a long-term strategic vision that extends beyond the current government's term. None of these ingredients require extraordinary political genius. They require political will. They require a government that understands what it has and decides deliberately to manage it for the benefit of the people over whom it is responsible. Brazil has that resource. It has the monopoly. It has the timing. What it has not yet demonstrated, at least not with niobium, is that political will. There is a version of the future in which Brazil, sitting on 92% of the metal that powers both the skeleton of the built world and the batteries of the electric future, becomes one of the most strategically important nations on Earth. In that version, Brazil builds processing facilities for niobium battery components. It requires that foreign companies manufacture on Brazilian soil as a condition of supply. It builds a sovereign fund from niobium revenues. It trains engineers, builds institutions, and captures not just the mineral, but the value chain. There is another version in which the pattern continues, in which niobium leaves Brazil as a raw material and returns as a product, manufactured in East Asia, sold at a premium, with the strategic leverage held by the buyers rather than the seller. Both versions are possible. The difference between them is not geological. It is not technological. It is not even financial. The difference is a decision made by people who may or may not understand what is beneath their feet. The Araxá Plateau sits quietly in the interior of a vast nation. The mine operates. The ore moves. The ferro-niobium loads onto trucks and ships and makes its way to steelmakers on 4 continents. In laboratories in São Paulo and Tokyo and Shanghai, scientists are trying to coax niobium atoms into battery structures that could replace lithium entirely. Some of them will succeed. The question is, who holds the rights when they do? The metal in your bridge, your building, your car, and possibly your next phone battery came from a place most people have never heard of. controlled by a country that has not yet decided what to do with the power it holds. That decision is coming. The world is watching, even if most of it does not know what it is watching for. The oil age was defined by who controlled the wells. The rare earth age was defined by who controlled the processing. The battery age will be defined by who controlled the mines before anyone else understood why it mattered. Niobium is still in that moment, the moment before everyone understands. This is Links of History, because nothing happening today began today.